Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is August the 28th, 2022, and we are about to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, history, and more. Without further ado, I jump into chat with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey. How are you?
I'm doing heckin' great. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Can't complain.
Let's play the Agent Smith tape, says the chat. There was a comment in the chat during the World of Tanks time that said that they could see you in like a suit and tie government agent kind of role, or you could be like degen, and they weren't sure which it was based on hearing you talk.
Probably more the latter than the former.
But I don't know, in the headcanon, having you in a suit and tie for the discussions is pretty badass. Could be. We'll have to see. But I was away this last week. Went to Hollywood to meet someone in particular, and it was basically a best case trip. So I had a fantastic time and have someone who I'm very excited about. Yeah. During the week, there was an article that kind of jumped out at me. I'm not sure how hyperbolic it might have been, but apparently China has the worst heat wave in the history of the world right now. And
I don't know enough background to know if it's the worst in the world, but yeah, it's definitely one of the worst they've had in a long time.
Yeah, so a bunch of rivers are drying up and I don't know. Lots of issues.
Yeah, the water levels in the Yangtze, Zhejiang, as they call it, have been relatively low, and that's a problem because the river generates a good chunk of hydroelectric power. Well, it generates a good chunk of electricity in China because there's a number of hydroelectric dams along the river. So that's actually been causing some shortages of electricity in China. And they've been having to ration it a little bit. I think Sichuan province in the west in particular has been impacted. So they've been asking people to try to keep their thermostat relatively high. I think they were saying that you shouldn't put it any lower than like 78 degrees or 80 degrees, something around there, Fahrenheit, obviously. And they were also asking people to do other little things, like not cool their offices too much, or stuff like that.
How would they track stuff like that?
They don't. I think it's mostly like an advisory type situation.
Yeah, more like the honor system rather than they're getting throttled.
Yeah. Yeah, there are electricity shortages, but they're not too bad. So much so that they're having to just shut down industries and whatnot. Again, that's because of the rationing. It's some of it's voluntary, like the advisories regarding temperature. But I think there are individual industries that have had to curtail production a little bit in order to try to limit consumption. So that's not been great for GDP.
Yeah, you can't really have the growth. That's like a survival move.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the big effects right now, economically, of the drought. It's also potentially going to cause problems for shipping because the Yangtze River is such an important artery for transportation in China. And the water levels are so low, or getting so low in some parts, that it's questionable whether or not they'll be able to continue shipping goods along the river if things get too much worse. So yeah, that also would have a fairly deleterious effect on total output for the year.
They're moving like big ships up and down the Yellow River most of the time.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a huge river. It's not hard to sail up and down it as you need. So there's barges, ships, container ships, what have you, that move goods generally more bulk goods, but I think also containers to and fro, up and down the river. So it's, shipping stuff or moving stuff by ship is still the most cost-effective way to move large amounts of stuff.
Hmm.
And so big rivers like that are frequently used for transportation in that manner. Yeah, you can ask the Germans about that right now. They're having the same problem with the Rhine River, which has historically been used to ship a lot of stuff, especially inputs for industry up and down, up along the river. But water levels in the river have fallen dramatically over the past couple of months on account of all of the heat and the drought and whatnot. And the result is that it's almost not navigable in some parts. So that'll be a big problem for them if they can't use the river, even if it's just for part of the year.
Is there any precedent of this happening before?
Not for a very long time. I mean, we're talking about Germany now, so yeah, the water levels haven't fallen this much in probably centuries, I want to say.
Hmm.
I mean, from what I was reading, there was some stones that they found that have been uncovered, which had basically a message saying that if you can see this rock, you're screwed. So apparently, there is some historical experience with this, but it's very negative. But yeah, they're having the same problem with hydroelectric power.
Hmm.
Because the water levels have fallen so much, there's much less electricity being generated. I've also read that it's apparently impacting nuclear reactors. I kind of knew nuclear reactors needed water, which is why they're generally built near like rivers and lakes and stuff, but I wasn't aware that a major drought could impact them. I don't know enough about that to really comment on it, but apparently that has been impacting electricity production in nuclear power plants as well as hydroelectric dams and whatnot. So just in general, there's a major electricity crunch in Europe right now. And they were already kind of hurting a bit because a lot of electricity had been generated by natural gas. And of course, Europe is having some issues with their principal natural gas supplier right now, such that there's much less supply than there usually would be.
Hmm.
And so that's resulted in some curtailment in electricity that had been generated by natural gas power plants. So between natural gas issues and hydroelectric issues, electricity has gotten pretty expensive in Europe recently for the past few months. And it's having an impact on, the overall health of the European economy. So both China and Europe getting it kind of in the same way in that regard.
Are those the two main areas that are impacted, or are there other areas of the world that have
I'm
similar
sure
stuff?
there are others, but those are the big ones I've read about. Those are pretty important parts of the global economy, right? The
Hmm.
European economy and the Chinese economy. So those are the ones that I've generally focused more on,
Hmm.
and which the BBC tends to focus more on. But yeah, there are probably other areas. Pakistan has been getting impacted, although in their case it's too much water
Yeah, I saw they got
rather
flooded.
than yeah. There's been some major flooding in Pakistan, and there's been some weather issues. There were some weather issues last year in 2021. We talked about them a bit, but there was a pretty big drought in South America at that time, as well as in India, which had some pretty dramatic impacts. There's also been a lot of high heat in India this year, although I don't know that they've had the same problems with drought. But even just the heat was sufficient to cause agricultural problems. A number of crops uh, can't really take that kind of heat that they experienced, and so some harvests were ruined as a result. So some wonky weather recently, having some dramatic economic impacts. Yeah, China can probably handle it, I would guess, because it's mostly more in the south.
Hmm.
I was asking a friend who lives in the north of China, what their experience of it was, and they said that they'd hardly read about it. They were hardly familiar with it. They hadn't been paying much attention. So obviously, it's having mixed impacts depending on where you live. But with Europe, the problem is that it's just really badly timed. You know, they're getting this geopolitical squeeze economically at the same time that they're getting squeezed by the weather. And so that just means that they're particularly caught off balance as a result.
Yeah, and that would not have affected China as much because they're a little bit more self-reliant.
Well, I mean, they still trade with Russia. It's no problem for them,
Oh,
you know,
right. They
if
didn't
Russia
get on the
invades a
sanctions
country in
train.
Europe. Yeah, yeah. You know, for Europe, it's a bigger issue
Mm.
because they're having to disentangle their economy from the Russian economy.
Mm.
And that's proving to be rather difficult because they'd been shifting more of their production towards natural gas based production. You know, a number of their manufacturing processes were natural gas intensive because natural gas had become so cheap over the past, 10, 20 years. And there was kind of probably a geopolitical element there too. You know, after Trump got elected, a number of European governments were not entirely comfortable with the direction the United States was taking. And so I kind of suspect they rather quietly hedged their bets by shifting the weight of their relations more towards Russia. That, of course, has not gone well. That was not the best hedge, it seems. But that probably is at least partly responsible for why they were not as willing to move away from Russian natural gas over the past 5 years in particular as they could have. But yeah, very interesting times in terms of the weather. It's definitely having economic impacts at this point that are broadly noticeable. I think the United States is still doing okay in that regard. California burns more than usual, but that's not necessarily too much of a problem for, say, Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area,
Mm.
or for economic activity in Southern California. In so much as California is having issues, it's more just with labor, probably more than anything right now.
Mm.
Some of the ports on the West Coast are still having issues with labor unrest. There's been a pretty dramatic confrontation between the unions representing port workers and some of the port authorities, and that's resulting in some slowdowns in the processing of shipments, with corresponding effects on the flow of goods and on inflation. Could be a while before that resolves. Yeah, there's still been some issues with either too much rain or too little in certain parts of the agriculturally productive regions of the United States. I remember reading months ago that the United States would not really be able to pick up the slack from a potential cutoff of Ukrainian agricultural exports because of weather-related issues in the United States. But I don't know that that's going to be so much of a problem as to impact actual food prices in the US. Food prices, I think, right now are impacted more by issues in the food processing industry rather than in actual farming.
Mm.
And what's the other one? Farming and animal husbandry. That doesn't sound right. Basically, cattle,
Ranching.
cattle, chickens, what ranching. There you go. So, farming, ranching, what have you. Those are still doing fine, as I understand it. But food processing has been experiencing problems with, labor shortages, along with much of the rest of the economy. There's also issues of the market being overly concentrated, but that's kind of another discussion there. But yeah, I think other than that, the Northeast and the Southeast have been doing okay weather-wise, so I don't know that they're too put off by all the wonky weather.
And then
So for
Texas is
now, we're
always
still doing
hot,
that.
so when they have a heat wave,
Yeah,
people are like, "Yep, it's
it's just
summer."
yeah, just kind of hot by default down here.
Mm.
We're kind of used to sheltering with air conditions into air conditioned spaces. And it's just kind of a natural reflex.
There's some of the usual questions about any update on Taiwan. I don't know if anything different has happened.
I think China did announce they were going to do some more war games around Taiwan.
Mhm.
So there's that. But I don't know that that's all that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. It's not uncommon for them to hold war games in the area. If they escalate things, then that'll be interesting. That could be worth watching. But I'm still, in general, pretty skeptical that they have anything dramatic planned. It's probably just signaling.
Mhm.
Part of the issue is that, American politicians keep going there. There's been more that have traveled to Taiwan since the Nancy Pelosi trip. It hasn't been, they haven't received as much coverage as Nancy Pelosi did, but it has been happening. So the Chinese government probably feels obligated to try to retaliate to some degree, to try to signal that it's not happy about it.
Mhm.
And, they probably would prefer to go just beyond the usual, verbal abuse, just complaining about it. So holding some more games kind of ticks all the right boxes. It shows that they're serious. It's kind of dramatic. It's kind of scary. I'm sure the media will be very interested in it, but I don't know that it's really a signifier of greater ambition on the part of the Chinese government at this point. Yeah, I'm really much more interested in what's going to happen with the transfer of, well, not the transfer of power per se, but the recognition, so to speak, of Xi Jinping's third term. He technically does have to be assigned the third term, politically, procedurally speaking, in the upcoming conference.
Mhm.
Can't remember what the technical name for the conference is, but it's a big CCP meetup that they have, and they're going to technically extend his term officially and legally there. So that's more what's of interest in China right now politically. How's that going? Is there any issues or problems that might be brewing behind the scenes there? Could there be some drama there? And if not, then after it's over, then what impact will the successful extension of his term in power mean for Chinese policy? Are they going to be more ambitious after the conference when his third term is set in stone? Or will they just kind of continue as is? So those are sort of the more interesting open questions as far as China right now. Taiwan is kind of a sideshow in a sense.
How long is each term?
And I think it's about 10 years. I want to say it's about 10 years. No, no, it's not 10 years, 5 years.
Mm.
Because he came into office in like 2012. So that would have been what? So 5 years would have been 2017.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's about 5 years. So his third term would be the next 5 years. Yeah, the way that transfers of power have worked in China since Deng Xiaoping took power in the late 70s, sort of the arrangement, the informal arrangement that the different factions within the Communist Party of China reached was that they would have one basically network that would be in power for 10 years at a time, so two terms of 5 years each. And then after that, they would alternate with some other group. And that's pretty much what they had been doing through the 1980s and then the 90s and then the aughts. But then over the past 10 years, Xi Jinping has signaled very heavily that he's not going to do that. So, he's basically explicitly throwing out that informal rule book by extending his term. Well, by having the third term, which technically is a breach of the implicit norms that had been created in the 1980s. Those norms were important. They were considered a key tool in order to manage intra-party competition. Because, if you know anything about mid 20th century Chinese history, you know that intra-party competition within the Communist Party of China was a problem. That was pretty much one of the key, if not the key driver of the Cultural Revolution, and that resulted in a considerable amount of violence and instability in China. Even before that, it had been a problem. Sort of the Great Leap Forward was partly a manifestation of that. That was partly a manifestation of Mao Zedong trying to stay relevant and maintain his power in the party. Because other figures had kind of taken the lead. Mao was more of a general. He was a military leader and an inspiring political leader. If you're a Chinese communist in the mid 20th century, anyway. But he was not so much an administrator. He even admitted himself that he was not good at economics. Like that was not his area. Uh, but he didn't like that other people who were good at administration were sort of stealing his thunder. And that's partly what led to him, pushing for that great leap forward, which of course was a massive disaster and led to his further marginalization within the party until he eventually was sufficiently cornered that he decided to make a big play, which turned into the Cultural Revolution in the mid 1960s. So intra-party competition, big problem. So they felt the need anyway at the end of the Cultural Revolution and the ejection of the Gang of Four from power to try to institute some kind of norms and rules to govern that competition. And so by having this alternating power system, they were hoping anyway that it would be managed. So, Deng Xiaoping and his cohort of, relative liberalizers, I think Zhao Ziyang was one of them, and then Hu Yaobang. So, that cohort, that group was in power through the 80s. And then in 90s, it shifted over to the Shanghai Gang, this group that was centered, it was a network that was centered in Shanghai. It was guys who basically had a history working together, governing Shanghai. And the leader there was, what's his name, Xiamen? Jiamen? I always forget his name. Frogman is how I remember him. The Chinese internet kind of used frogs as a euphemism to refer to him and his period in power. Some people remember the 90s relatively fondly. Jiang Zemin, was that it? That's
Why
going to
is he
bug the
called
hell out of me.
Frogman?
He actually kind of looks like a frog. He's kind of got a face that kind of that is somewhat frog-like, if you like.
Like
Yeah, Jiang Zemin.
like
There you
Kermit.
go. Not so much Kermit, like more like an actual frog. Yeah, politicians are not always the most sexy people.
Yeah, well, the way that you described it was it's what is it? Hollywood for ugly people or something?
Oh yeah, yeah. Washington is Hollywood for ugly people.
Yeah.
That's the old joke, yeah. So yeah, Jiang Zemin is remembered somewhat fondly, but the current government doesn't entirely like people sort of comparing and contrasting different governments. They kind of think it makes them look bad, so they tend to discourage it. So the Chinese internet being what it is, it kind of relies on euphemisms and whatnot to try to get around some of the censorship that happens there. And so referring to frogs and whatnot and the frogman is kind of one of the ways that they have done that. So let's see, in the 90s, it was the Shanghai Gang. And then in the aughts, it was the Communist Party Youth League. There's a cohort of politicians that sort of moved up the party hierarchy who got their start in the Communist Party Youth League. And that group was led by Hu Jintao, who was a paramount leader over the course, roughly from like 2000 to 2010, basically. So that was where you get guys like Wen Jiabao, Grandpa Wen, and probably some other guys that I don't even remember anymore. But so that was the group in power at that time. And so then, starting in I want to say 2012, Xi Jinping came back in, and so his cohort, his group, so to speak, is a little hard to describe. I mean, patronage networks within China and the different factions don't really have ideological consistency. It's really based much more about who you know, who owes you favors, who's in whose network, that kind of thing. And all of that happens within the context of an opaque political system. So it's kind of hard to map out in any systematic, extensive way.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, Xi Jinping was considered more of a leftist. So in so much as in so much as that's a consistent ideological factor in his network, that's one way you could describe them. Although he also kind of had to turn on one of the other big left leaders, Bo Xilai, who had been the governor of Sichuan province for a long time. That was its whole own set of drama. But I could have sworn that in a China class I took in grad school, I had a Hong Kong professor, and I could have sworn he told me that Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping were actually friends and allies within China's politics. But then I've never heard anybody say that ever again. And everything I read, they're always described as rivals. So there was some kind of drama there anyway, regardless. But really, if I had to describe Xi Jinping's network, certainly Xi Jinping himself, I would describe it more as like a princeling network. So within the context of Chinese politics, princelings are the people who are descended from earlier revolutionary leaders from the early mid 20th century. So, these people were leaders of the Communist Party of China, generally mid 20th century, high ranking figures, high ranking generals, administrators, what have you. And, the party is supposed to be egalitarian, it's supposed to be communist and whatnot, but in practice, it doesn't matter what ideology you have. Institutions almost invariably work the same everywhere. And in general, people who are very successful, economically or politically, are generally able to get better opportunities for their children.
Mm-hmm.
And so the result is that the children of the revolutionary leadership in the mid 20th century are very well connected, very well educated, and generally pretty well off financially, owing to corruption generally. So as a result, there is a pretty large cohort within the Communist Party of China that is just dominated by people who are sufficiently well connected because of their parents and their parents' history in the party that they just inherently have political power. Sometimes that's justified. Sometimes they actually are just good administrators, good leaders. But sometimes it's just nepotism, like they're not very effective, but they can kind of free ride on their parents' success and connections. And I would also point out here, and this is an important point, not all princelings are a part of like the same network. It's not like they all know each other and get along. Frequently, not infrequently, they're also rivals. Again, factions in China are not ideologically consistent. It's just about who you know and who you trust. So some princelings trust other princelings, some don't. Xi Jinping is one of the big princelings. His father was a major leader in the party who was also, I'm probably everybody's pretty familiar with Xi Jinping's history at this point, but for those of you who are not, Xi Jinping's father was a major bigwig in the party, but he was purged in the Cultural Revolution and ended up dying. Now, even just having family who were purged was a pretty big deal, and so Xi Jinping himself ended up getting sent to the countryside. Basically purged for. He was sent to the countryside for quote unquote re-education, and he ended up being pretty well marginalized within the party hierarchy as a result. But even so, he actually never really, well, as far as we can tell anyway, he never lost his faith in communism, or at least the Communist Party of China. And so he actually went out of his way to try to move up the party hierarchy and restore his name and reputation within the party. And obviously, he was quite successful in doing so. He was able to eventually become paramount leader. And he was able to build up his network, in doing so over time until eventually it was the leading network. So some of the people in his network are princelings. Some of them are just very effective administrators. It's kind of a mixed bag there. But in general, if I had to describe a common theme, it generally tends to be relatively more left-wing within the context of Chinese politics.
When you say someone
So
gets
that's
purged, what does that mean? Like you said, some people are sent to the countryside. Do they kill some other people?
they generally, well, there were a lot of executions, but generally those were more by the Red Guard. The Red Guard kind of had carte blanche as far as, identifying class enemies and dealing with them however they wanted. So there were a lot of executions in that time, but people who were more officially purged were generally people who were either accused or were actually guilty of some kind of corruption or perhaps some kind of ideological sin of some kind. So those people would be identified and generally imprisoned. Maybe one of the most famous cases was, what was his name? I think his name was Liu Shaoqi. And Liu Shaoqi, if I'm not mixing up names anyway, was one of the best administrators that the party had at the time in the mid 20th century, even in the early mid 20th century. And he was a big rival of Mao, or at least Mao considered him a rival anyway. And he was targeted in these purges. He was said to be not sufficiently communist. Basically, he was too bureaucratic. He was too much of an administrator and not enough of an ideologue in the eyes of some of the most extreme communists in China at the time. And so the result is that he was arrested and then imprisoned. And, he had health problems, not least because, they didn't really feed him properly and whatnot. But I think he also had diabetes or something. And so they just stopped giving him medicine while he was imprisoned. So he was never executed per se, but he was basically allowed to die due to mistreatment. So that's probably the more common way that people died during this period when purges were being
Mm.
committed. Yeah, there were earlier purges where people actually were executed. I think you were talking with the World of Tank crowd there about some of the purges of landowners, for example.
Hmm.
And yeah, that was a real thing. That was more in the early 50s as part of what was called the anti-rightist campaign. And there was a significant number of perceived ideological enemies that were targeted then, up to and including landowners, but also people who had been major business owners or perhaps the sons, well, children of business owners, just among other people. Landowners in particular were a target because the Communist Party wanted to maintain the support of rural people, whom were disproportionately, farmers. And in particular, they had the support of farmers who did not own their own land.
Hmm.
And so large landowners who had land to be redistributed were a particular target for the party in order to try to maintain legitimacy. So those people were disproportionately targeted for execution, among other things. And there were other campaigns also. There was another campaign after the 100 Flowers campaign, which was nominally a campaign that encouraged people to critique the party. That was quickly followed by a crackdown.
That's bait.
Yeah, yeah. Well, from what I've read, it was not originally intended to be bait. It was originally intended to be like an honest attempt at appraising, the successes and failures of the party. But the party ended up getting a lot more negative feedback than they liked, and so they ended up going after some of the leading criticizers. So some of those people were also targeted for execution. Yeah, I would point out here, and this is basically just trivia, but one of the reasons that the party focused on re-education so much, as opposed to just executing everybody, is that re-education was seen as the more humane approach to dealing with dissent. So that technically was the party trying to be nice, so to speak. Although it probably was not seen as such by the people who had to suffer it. Just touching on the landowner thing, there actually are many, many landowners and landlords in China right now. Yeah, they're right that all of the land is technically owned by the state. That's true. Uh, but you're still allowed to kind of rent stuff out and whatnot. You can buy a property and rent as you like, so that's not at all unusual. So there are definitely landlords. That was a big reform that happened in the reform period starting in the 1980s. Although I don't think they actually liberalized property markets until like the late 90s. I think that's more when that started. Before that, it was still all owned by the state. But since then, property markets have opened up considerably. So you can totally speculate on land, speculate on buildings, overcharge people for their rent, and otherwise be a slumlord as need be.
Yeah, Fuzzy Core was kind of jokingly pointing out that sometimes they'll just rename something, but then it ends up serving the same function, but it doesn't sound like it's the previous big bad, like the landlord.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think a really good example of that is the special economic zones. These were the zones that were opened up for foreign investment. And they tried to attract the foreign investment by having a more liberalized regime of laws and regulations within these zones. And it was very successful. But if you look at a map of the zones, it looks suspiciously familiar,
Gerrymandering?
right? No, 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 gerrymandering. It's if you look at a map of the special economic zones, you can then compare it to the treaty ports in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, China was basically a closed market, and you could only trade as a foreigner with China basically through Canton, what is now Guangzhou. And that's a port city in the far south. So the Chinese government tried to mitigate contact with Westerners and limit foreign influence by trying to focus all foreign trade, especially with Europeans, into Canton. That was the famous Canton system. And what happened then was a series of wars, I think principally the Opium Wars, that China lost, and one of the conditions of the peace agreements that was signed is that a number of ports along the east coast of China had to be open to trade. And more and more ports were open to trade over the course of the 19th century. So these were called treaty ports because they were opened by the series of treaties that were signed between China and the West and the Western imperial powers. Treaties that have been remembered as the quote unquote unequal treaties within China. So if you look at a map showing all of the treaty ports, in the mid late 19th century, it looks almost exactly the same as the map of special economic zones. It's actually pretty funny.
I'm looking for a
But of
map of the
course,
special economic zones now.
let's see, special economic China. Let's see. I remember seeing a good one a long time ago.
There's the one on Wikipedia here.
That might be the best way to go.
Special administrative regions and special economic zones of People's Republic of China. They've got B and A and then 1 through 6.
Yeah, they've proliferated pretty rapidly over time. It was originally mostly just in the south, and then they started expanding to other areas. So now they're everywhere, and it's not uncommon for new zones to be announced.
Hmm.
Oh, that's not bad. I'll send you this thing here. Let's see. And this is actually a PDF file, but the map is on page 13. Let me find you here, Neuro. So that just shows you how many there are. And then treaty ports.
Economic and technological development zones. 2010. Oh yeah, that's a lot more than the image on Wikipedia.
Yeah, there's a whole kit and caboodle. So this is probably, let's do, not bad. So we can do that as the treaty port map. Gonna have to scroll down a little bit for that one, but I think it's about a little more than halfway down. You can see it, map 3.
I see it.
So you can roughly see how similar they are, how they kind of concentrate along the coast mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So the Communist Party of China would not describe special economic zones as latter-day treaty ports, because that would be politically uncouth, if you like.
Because it would link them to the West.
It would link them to the period of humiliation,
Oh yeah.
in which China was being, sort of systematically and regularly humiliated by the West. And the Chinese government does not want to be seen to be dependent on, the West in any way, certainly not for, the economy. But in effect, they work very similarly. The treaty ports and the economic zones effectively played the same role in the development of China's economy
Mm-hmm.
over in their respective time periods.
What is Macau's relationship to China?
It's the same relationship that Hong Kong has with China.
Mm.
It's what is it? Two systems, one country, right? So Macau kind of is autonomous; it can govern itself, but it is part of China.
Mm-hmm.
Although in Macau's case, they're a lot further along in integrating with mainland China than Hong Kong is. Macau's population was always very small, and the economy never really took off like Hong Kong's did. Hong Kong's economy did very well, starting in sort of the mid late 20th century. And so they kind of developed their own identity, a large population. Hong Kong was very much its own thing there.
Hmm.
But Macau, not so much. It was never all that prosperous. I don't think it even had a population over 100,000 people. It was relatively small compared to Hong Kong. And so when Macau was sort of reabsorbed into China, when the Portuguese handed it over in the, I want to say the mid 90s, the Chinese investment that came into the territory quickly dominated the economy. So Macau now is basically China's Las Vegas. It's where all of their principal gambling institutions are. So it's a big entertainment center for the country now.
Is gambling illegal in mainland China?
Yeah, for the most part, I think so.
Hmm.
Certainly, it's illegal enough that it's easier just to set up in Macau.
Hmm.
And a number of Western gambling firms have actually invested there. I think one of the top, what is it, WinStar?
Hmm.
I think is one of the top gambling companies in the US. They have a lot of investments in Macau. So it's a big entertainment hub, although obviously it's taken a pretty big hit, over the past couple years because of COVID and, lockdowns and whatnot. But the point here is that there was so much investment into the entertainment sector in Macau that a huge number of people moved into the territory to work in that sector. And the result is that most of the people who live in Macau now are people from the mainland. The actual native population, so to speak, has been pretty well drowned out
Hmm.
by new migrants. So Macau is much more integrated, demographically, politically, and economically with the mainland. Whereas Hong Kong, still has strong economic ties, but most of the population is still sort of native born, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah, there
And
was
they still have
a few of the pro American poker players who are like mainly focused on online stuff who maybe they were in tax trouble or it was just whenever online poker was made illegal, but some of them just straight up moved to Macau.
there you go.
And I went to a WinStar casino driving, I think it's like right over the Oklahoma border with Kukyo a while back. That was one of our like pilot missions to try out playing poker and see what that was like. And that was really early in my understanding of the game. So at that point, he was a lot better of a poker player than me. And it was cool to kind of see the process of it's like fishing in a way if you're going to a live poker table where you're putting yourself in the environment where you could make some money and you're kind of waiting for a fish that is a bad player to make a mistake and then you can capitalize on that, but the pacing of it is so slow compared to online poker.
Oh,
You
really?
can do, yeah, you can do like 6 tables at a time, so the decisions that you're making are like really snappy. You need to make a decision, move on to the next window, make a decision. Whereas live poker, you've got people who are like kind of drunk at the table and they take a really long time for their turn, and then the cards physically have to be dealt out to people and stuff. So I ended up really not liking the casino environment and not pursuing cash games in that sense. It's a lot more
Mm.
fun to just be a hermit at home and play on the computer.
I can sympathize.
Yeah.
I do a considerable amount of that myself.
Yeah, casinos do a lot of work to try to make the clients feel like they're wealthy and that they're very special and honored at that establishment. So the more you spend there, the more you feel like a king or queen and the more likely you are to come back because you feel like they value you. And really, it's like they know that you're going to lose more money than they give you in like gifts and service and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a nice con. You can make a lot of money if you're the house.
Mm-hmm.
Not great for economic development, I'm afraid.
No, it's kind of just sloshing money around. You're not really generating new stuff.
Hmm. And a lot of new value, and it attracts a lot of vice,
Tom Dwan in
which it,
the chat. Yes, that's the guy. Dur was his online handle. He was the guy who ran to Macau. He was one of my favorite poker players because he was very young. He was around our age at the time. And the old guard of historically god tier poker players all thought he was really dumb and they didn't respect him. So watching him beat them was pretty entertaining. And he
Yeah,
did this
must have
thing
been.
where he got his nickname Durr, where he just like makes a really stupid face after he makes a huge bet, and you don't know if he just made a big mistake, he's bluffing, or he's got the actual best hand because he just looks so dumb. What is your poker face? Is it a serious grimace or a derpy face?
Well, whatever works, right?
True.
Well, let's see. I'm trying to backtrack a little bit here. It was
Special economic zones, and then I saw Macau on the map, and I was like, what even is that?
and then that was from China.
Mm-hmm.
What were we talking about China for?
We talked about the drought. We talked about the like nepotism of the
Yeah.
princelings, and then the opium wars and the period of humiliation. We talked about the housing situation there.
We didn't talk about the housing too much. We talked about it before. I
Yeah,
think we were
last week.
talking about, yeah, it was the
Are there,
shadow banks and whatnot.
were there any updates with that?
I don't think so. I think the Chinese government did relax their principal mortgage rate. The Central Bank of China, that is to say, the People's Bank of China, technically, lowered the prime mortgage rate, basically. So that kind of eases some of the pressure on, mortgage holders who are kind of stuck paying a mortgage for a house that may or may not get built,
Mm-hmm.
depending on circumstances. But I don't know how necessary that is to the health of the overall economy. I suspect that's more of a political move than anything. Yeah, I was reading that most people in China do not buy real estate using mortgages. So it's actually a pretty small portion of the population that actually has mortgages of any kind. Generally, people, from what I was reading, generally people just pool money from friends and family, probably more family, and then that's how they invest.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't cost you quite so much in interest, that is. I'm sorry to whoever was bothered with me last time. I wasn't eating. I was actually sucking on ice. I didn't think it would be as noticeable as it was. So I apologize if that bothered people.
It's okay. Audio stuff is hard. Yeah, one of the funny things about doing audio on a stream like this is everyone's output for their audio is different. So you've got some people watching the stream from a phone, some people watching it from headphones, other people have like a speaker system, and you'll have, like today we had some complaints about an echo, which for some people they're like, there's hardly anything, it's fine. And then someone else was saying that it's almost unbearable, and it's physically impossible for me to optimize it for everyone. There's not a way to do that, but I can try. Sometimes you just split the difference. You have someone who say it's
There you
too
go.
quiet, and then another person says it's too loud. And it's like, all right, now it's good.
That China thing. I feel like I wandered off of something when we were talking about China.
Wandered off on the
Or
treaty
what was
ports.
the yeah, what was the lead in for that? Because I remember I was talking about Xi Jinping
Mm-hmm.
and intra-party competition and the succession.
And his third term.
Oh, Taiwan, that's what it was. So
Yeah.
people were asking about Taiwan, and I was saying I was more focused on the transition of power,
Mm.
or the transition to the third term for Xi Jinping. And I was explaining how Xi Jinping broke the norms of succession as far as alternating power between factions within the party. So that was the significance of that. So because he broke those norms, it's possible that on the one hand he could get more done because he doesn't have to worry as much about other factions and keeping them in check. He's pretty much dominated most of the competing factions within the party. But then the downside is that there could be a return to violent intra-party competition if at some point he loses legitimacy and some of the opposing competing factions sense weakness. So for now, he looks like he's very strong, but that could change just depending on how things go. It remains to be seen just what his third term will look like and how Chinese politics will respond to some of the changes and challenges, policy challenges specifically, that Xi Jinping's government is facing.
Random guess, I would say that it's going to be the most difficult term because of the different climate issues that they're having now, and then also just the general world pressure to update their like energy sector and how that all works and lower their pollution and that kind of a thing, which generally makes it harder to just directly profit and grow.
Mhm.
The best way to make dollars today is to get the surefire methods of revenue that already exist and that don't really factor in like being clean. It's like you just get the stuff that gives you the most kaboom right away, which is going to be like natural gas and oil and things like that. And then it costs money for factories and companies to regulate their waste, which could be profit. So there's always that resistance. It's kind of like a tug of war that's happening now. And it needs to get sufficiently bad that there's broad-based change. We'll see.
Yeah, there's been a great reliance on investment in China to try to generate economic growth.
Mm.
That's the old equation, right? GDP equals government spending plus total consumption plus exports minus imports, and then plus investment, specifically business investment. Although also government investment in this case, there's kind of an overlap in China's case. So in China, well, in the United States, in like a Western modern economy, a developed economy, generally consumption is the largest factor, is the principal driver of economic growth and the economy generally. But in China's case, it's generally been more government spending and investment. Those have been the principal drivers. And for a long time, that was fine because there was a lot to invest in. China needed to catch up to the West in terms of having modern infrastructure and modern connections, to the rest of the world, and investing in new capital equipment, stuff like that. So there was a great deal of catch-up growth to be had, and that was responsible for a lot of the economic growth they've had over the past couple decades. But other than areas of the economy where where there's a shortage of, skilled workers or technical expertise, some of the more advanced areas of economic activity, they've more or less caught up. And the trouble there is that they have not yet transitioned into a consumption-led economy. So there's not really anything left to invest in per se on a broad-based level that's going to generate large economic growth, at least not of the scale that we've seen over the past couple decades. But there's not any alternative yet that's really emerged. The consumer-driven economy that kind of characterizes modern economies has not come to define China's economy yet. The Chinese government is trying to make that transition, but it's been very difficult. There's a number of sort of blocks that are holding up that transition. For example, they lack a modern safety net, right? In a Western economy, you generally have things like in the US's case, we have Social Security, right? And we have unemployment benefits, and we don't really have national health care, but we do have some government spending on health care. We have like Medicare, Medicaid, and whatnot. Europe has these to a much greater degree, social benefits of one sort or another. In China, they don't have that. Technically, legally, they do, but in practice, it doesn't really amount to much. And there's a lot of corruption. Sometimes you have to bribe doctors to take care of you. So, that's a problem, right? So you can't really count on that to save you in the event that something happens to you. If you have a major health crisis, if you lose your job, or if you want to retire. In all of these cases, you pretty much have to depend on yourself and your own savings. And the result is that there's a much higher savings rate amongst Chinese citizens than there is amongst other people in, say, the developed world, where people are generally secure enough in future income because they have these kinds of supports for emergency situations and as well as for retirement, that they're more willing to spend. The propensity to spend, the propensity to consume in Western developed economies is much higher because of this factor than in China. So that's one block, and that's not really something the Chinese government can do a whole lot about because really providing Western style social benefits to a population of 1.4 billion people is extremely expensive, and GDP per capita in China right now is not really high enough to support that. So, in order to really make that transition, they would need greater GDP, and they would therefore really need to have the private sector grow a lot more so that there could be more jobs, higher incomes, new economic activity that could generate the tax revenue that would be necessary for that. But then you get into a kind of chicken and egg argument. Like, if you could have that kind of growth, then you wouldn't have to worry about, you wouldn't have to worry about making this transition to a consumption-driven economy. It would basically just happen organically at that point. So, do you need the government benefits first and then get a consumer-driven economy, or do you organically evolve into a consumer-driven economy and then get the social benefits? Ideally, you would just take a hands-off approach and let the economy develop naturally. But in China's case, their political economy does not really allow that. And so they're kind of trying to manage the development in sort of a more artificial manner. And that's worked relatively well up until now. So now they're kind of having to make some hard decisions about, the degree to which that state-managed economy can continue to generate significant growth and continue to reach and meet political objectives of one kind or another, like high employment, strategic self-sufficiency, and critical goods and services, this kind of stuff. So at the very least, they're not going to get social benefits first, so that's going to continue to be a barrier. But beyond that, as far as like other barriers and stuff, uh, things like the lack of modern expertise, I already mentioned that. Corruption, political corruption is often a big deal. The ideally you would have an economy where people can just freely innovate and set up businesses and whatnot, and in which friction between the private sector and the public sector is minimized. You don't want the public sector inhibiting or discouraging or disincentivizing business formation and other forms of economic activity. In China, there's a great deal of that. Even as much as they've opened up in the reform period, there was still a lot of factors blocking business formation and normal economic activity. The main factor that determines success in China's economy is still guanxi. That's that your basically networking. Your extended network of people who you can rely on for favors, for money, or more importantly, in this case, for protection. If you know somebody in government, they can protect you from other predatory government officials and can help your business succeed where otherwise it would fail. If there's a business set up by somebody who has no connections and it's competing with somebody who does have connections, guess who's going to win out? It's
Mm.
going to be the guy with connections. Not only because those connections are going to protect them from predatory government practices and corrupt officials, but also because those government officials that you have connections with can use those same negative factors to crush your opposition, to go after your competition and mitigate their success. So, in general, China has been able to grow in spite of that because it still sort of it's still conducive to economic growth. There's sort of different types of corruption. Chinese corruption is more conducive to growth than, say, Russian corruption, which tends to be much more parasitic and much more antithetical to business formation and economic activity. In China's case, the government is basically a kind of joint partner in business activity. And so, in that sense, the Chinese approach is better because at least you still get the economic growth. But we're kind of reaching the limits of what that model can achieve. So at this point, they would need to kind of cut out the government more and have more of an open market where the private sector can breathe more and have more competition. But that, of course, would be a very heavy lift for any kind of reformer in China, because the patronage networks that comprise the Communist Party of China are heavily dependent on, money derived from corruption to maintain and sustain those patronage networks. And so there's a serious conflict of interest between the Communist Party of China and those and corruption. They kind of depend on that in large part. Well, this, that, or the other faction depends on that to compete with other factions and to sustain itself. So it's going to be really hard to change that. Maybe Xi Jinping has enough power that he could try to do that, but it's probably not going to happen. Because not only are you dependent as the leader of a patronage network on, corrupt money to try to sustain your power within the context of the party and intra-party competition, but it's also a useful tool to use as a bludgeon against other people that you're competing with in the party. So maybe some people remember the Tigers and Flies campaign a couple of years ago in China. That was when the Chinese government cracked down on corruption within the party. And they said that they would go after, all kinds of officials, low-level officials, which they called flies, and then even the highest levels officials engaged in corruption, which they referred to as the Tigers. And yeah, that was good. Everybody liked that in China. Everybody wants less corruption, but in practice, that was not so much an anti-corruption campaign, but that was a manifestation of intra-party competition in which one faction, Xi Jinping's faction, used anti-corruption investigations as a tool to compete with, fight, and destroy large, powerful, competing factions within the party. I think the big one that they went after was what was his name? Zhao Young something. He at the time he was the head of Sinopec, basically the ministry of, well, not the minute. He was the head of the ministry that managed oil production in China, the petroleum industry, and he actually had been a high-ranking official in the security apparatus. So if you're a high-ranking official in the security apparatus, you're going to get well networked, right? You're going to meet a lot of powerful, influential people because that's an important part of the Chinese government. And of course, the petroleum ministry was itself very large, controlled a lot of resources. It controls some of the largest state-owned enterprises in China. So that's also a very powerful political apparatus through which to network with people and build a patronage network. So that was a big competing power center, and that was, all but annihilated by Xi Jinping as a result of this anti-corruption campaign. And so all manner of people with connections to this guy who had been the head of that patronage network were also investigated and sent to jail. And of course, the CCP painted it as a broad-based effort to investigate corruption at all levels amongst anybody and everybody, but really it was much more focused than that. So kind of a misrepresentation there on the part of Chinese propagandists. But this is just what, intra-party competition looks like, and this is why it's unlikely that they'll actually, stop uh, preying on businesses in China. They kind of need that tool available both to compete with other people and for their own purposes. How did I get onto that? Oh, corruption, the inter-party competitions. Do you remember the genesis of that?
So we went to Taiwan for a little bit,
Yeah.
and then we talked about mortgages and the housing. We talked about Xi Jinping's ascension. We talked about getting rid of the tigers and the, what was the other one?
Tigers and Flies campaign,
Tigers
yeah,
and
the
flies.
anti-corruption drive. But I was talking about intra-party competition
Mm-hmm.
and how that's not going to change. Oh, right, barriers to China's economy shifting to a consumption-driven economy, right? So political corruption is a big barrier there. So political corruption, the lack of public supports for people, and lack of human capital. They've still got a lot of human capital, but the trouble is they haven't been able to generate enough like jobs for all of them. There's just not enough business formation to actually employ all of them. So, unemployment for people who have like college education is an issue in China.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually getting to be more of an issue, especially more recently with all of the lockdowns and whatnot. But let's see. Other structural. Those are sort of the big ones. The political is sort of the main one. and then maybe the lack of a sort of sophisticated, the lack of a modern financial sector is also a barrier because that makes it difficult to raise capital without having connections. So, capital is kind of more politicized at this point than it should be. But yeah, those are all problems with China shifting to a consumption-driven economy. And so that's the big thing that they're kind of struggling with right now. So because they have not successfully made that transition, I think this was the original point I was kind of trying to drive at. They've historically been dependent on investment to drive economic growth. They want to transition to a modern consumption-driven economy, but because that's not happening for this, that, or the other reason, the government has increasingly depended on investment in unproductive activities. Right? They're still using investment to try to generate growth, but the things they're investing in are less and less productive and are producing lower and lower returns on investment. And so that's not going to work over the long term, right? You can only it's creating problems in the banking sector because if you're not getting, sufficient return on investment to pay for the investment, then the balance sheets of the banks are just deteriorating over time. And we can see productivity in China falling. We can see investments becoming less productive. That's appeared in data that's been reported. So that's like a real thing for them. So this transition to a consumption-driven economy needs to happen. It's not just something that's desirable and that would create higher GDP per capita and a more sustainable economy. Uh, it has to happen for political reasons because the Chinese government can only generate economic growth via investment for so long before the debt accumulated as a result of that investment from Chinese banks and other institutions will just become so great that it causes a financial crisis of some kind. You know, they could probably contain it to a degree, but it would probably come at the cost of significant moral hazards. It would come at the cost of long-term objectives that they wouldn't be able to achieve, and there would be significant short-term disruption, probably. So, there's significant costs that would be incurred if they continue trending along this current path that they're on of just investing more and more into stuff that is not returning on that investment. So that being the case, they have to do this, but it's not clear if they can or uh, if they even know how to do it. That's sort of been one of the big topics of conversation amongst economists watching China has been the different industrial policies and other policies that are intended to try to develop and modernize China's economy and to get it beyond the middle income trap, as it's called. This sort of point of GDP per capita and income at which developing economies tend to kind of get stuck and beyond which they struggle to move.
Is this like when people are reaching the middle class and they have some disposable income, but they don't like spend it on stuff?
No, it's more like GDP, it's more like median income sort of getting stuck around like 10 to 20K per
Hmm.
person. And that's US dollars nominal.
Hmm.
So roughly that's the area we're talking about. So, developed economies generally have GDP per cap more around like 40 to 70K per cap. Uh, that's roughly more the range you need to be in order to kind of be considered developed. And a lot of economies do pretty well in progressing towards that, but then once they get that middle income area, sort of 10 to 20K, they tend to stagnate. They tend to struggle to kind of get beyond that level. Part of that is because some of these countries are smaller, and so there's only so much economic activity they can generate. Um, in some cases, it's because they're very large, so they can have regions of the economy that do really well, but then other regions kind of stagnate and don't really move up the ladder, so to speak, with the wealthy developing regions. And so they act as drags on sort of the overall GDP per capita number. But yeah, that's a problem that China has right now. They're trying not to get stuck at that level. And like I mentioned, if they can't depend on investment to generate growth in the future, which they can't because of the accumulating debt issue, then they're either going to economically stagnate, which is going to be a problem over time, as far as things like paying for the demographic issue. More and more people are reaching retirement age, and the dependency ratio is going to be a problem because those people are going to need to be paid for, and that's going to stress government finances to some degree, Unless, of course, they just kick the ball back to people and say, hey, they're your relatives. You deal with them. That's kind of what they're doing now. So maybe it's not going to be as much of a problem as people think it is. But nominally, that's at least going to be some kind of issue that the government will have to deal with. And that's generally cited as one of the problems they'll face in the future if they can't increase GDP per capita and productivity in the economy. But, that among other issues is are sort of the impetus towards improving the economy. So we'll see if they can do that or not. That remains to be seen. This is really scatterbrained today. I'm just all over the place.
Seems fine to me. Let's just keep a track of the steps in the chain. Going on tangents is fine. It's one of the things we do best here. And also, China's got
Yeah,
a lot of
lots
stuff
of
going on in an opaque system, so I admire your courage in trying to untangle it.
it's just it's a layman's approach. I just depend on commentators and analysts and articles and stuff. So this, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. The usual disclaimer. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So feedback is definitely appreciated. I love, learning from chat and getting the feedback. Or at least, absent that, I enjoy the witty comments. Those are always fun as well. But yeah, I try my best. I try to, you know, take a analytical approach to trying to understand some of the difficult issues and try to explain them in a way that's comprehensible. Sometimes I'm more successful in some attempts than others. Sometimes I'm just sort of scatterbrained and I go on these little tangents, and so yeah, it can get a little confusing. But best effort anyway. That's what I aim for.
Yep. I did a podcast a while back, ship it at 80%, and that's kind of the spirit of how a lot of content creation has to happen, because you can always iterate more on a discussion or a line of thinking or a thought, and you can polish it and tighten it and make it even more crisp and efficient. But if you never release it until it's like at 100%, you're never going to release it because it gets harder and harder to polish the last bits of that. So we just do it live, and if we mess up, you can tell us. I saw in
What
chat
was it?
there was a mention of some rail strikes in the ANZ region,
The what region?
Australia, New Zealand.
Oh, Anzac.
Maybe that's what it is.
I hadn't heard about that. I have heard about rail strikes in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Those have been pretty disruptive. Well, actually, they haven't been that disruptive from what I was reading. Yeah, a lot of people have apparently not been traveling as much because of lockdowns and stuff. And, there hasn't been as many lockdowns lately, but there's still not nearly as many people traveling as there had been
Mm-hmm.
along the rail lines anyway. But yeah, there had been a big rail strike amongst rail workers in the UK in the past month or two. I remember reading something about that, but I don't know what became of it or if it's still going on or whatnot. It's probably not helping with the inflation. Yet more supply chain snarls, basically. But I hadn't heard about anything equivalent in Australia or New Zealand. That would certainly be news to me.
The other big ticket thing that I saw, you mentioned it briefly, was Pakistan had that huge flood. It said there were
Hmm.
20 million people affected. It didn't mean that they were like flooded out, but it would affect them in some way, which is pretty major. And then Pakistan is a country that I think a lot of people in the US don't really realize how big of a population it has. When you understand the history of it, used to be part of India, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a pretty high density part of the world in terms
Oh
of
yeah.
people living there.
Oh yeah. What is it? I think it's about 200 million now.
Mm-hmm.
200 million population. Look it up. 220 million. Okay. And most of that is pretty heavily concentrated along the Indus River, one of the major rivers in South Asia. Yeah, Pakistan had been part of India. It was part of British India, and there was a lot of disagreements in the early 20th century between Muslims and Hindus in India about just what kind of India they would have upon independence from Britain. And for a while, there was serious consideration about a system that could have maintained the integrity of British India. I think what was it? It was a system of reservations, basically. There was a very large percentage of seats in the parliament that would have gone specifically to Muslims. They would have been reserved for Muslim politicians, basically. And the number of reserved seats would have actually been larger as a proportion of the number of total seats in parliament than the proportion of Muslims in the population. And so that, of course, would have given them power disproportionate to their population, but that was considered a necessary concession in order to ensure that they ensured the Muslim areas of India remained part of India upon independence.
Mhm.
And there were a lot of disagreements and negotiations over that. I think at one point they also had a weird system set up in which India would be a confederacy, a confederation of states, and the government would be relatively weak and decentralized. Uh, and states would have the option of grouping together voluntarily as a part of these sort of associations in which they would have share similar laws and jurisdictions and whatnot on subjects and areas of common interest. And the reason they, kind of landed on that design for the government is that, it would have allowed Jinnah, who was the main leader of the Muslim community in British India at the time, it would have allowed him to deliver on a political promise he'd made to provide, to get a Pakistan, to get a independent Muslim nation carved out of British India. So technically, the Muslim provinces would have still been part of would have been part of India and independent India, but because of the carve out, to allow for associations of states, the Muslim states could have built their own voluntary associations and formed a kind of de facto mini state within India. And so that was the concession that the Indian National Congress made to the Muslim League during the negotiations around independence. So that eventually fell apart. There were lots of people within Congress that were very skeptical of that. The Muslim League was pretty happy with the concessions, but they wanted more. And eventually that led to the collapse in the negotiations. And at that point, the British kind of made the decision for them almost. The British said that the negotiations in question were supposed to be like the main negotiations deciding on a final agreement as far as what independent India would look like. And the British government was just hemorrhaging cash at this point. They had spent so much money over the course of World War II, and they just needed to cut costs. And the Attlee government was in power at that time in the UK, and they were looking at some major spending projects, up to and including the National Health Service, the famous healthcare institution in the United Kingdom, which gives free care at the point of service. So that was being designed at the time, but it was going to be very expensive. So that was also an impetus to cut costs. And so the British government basically ordered British officials in India to expedite the process. We need to get out. This is too expensive. We're spending way too much money, maintaining our presence in India, so we have to get out. And when the talks failed between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Indian National Congress, the British government just said, okay, Congress is going to get Hindu India, and then Muslim India is going to go to the Muslim League. And they just decided to carve it up according to which areas had majority Muslim or majority other, this, that, or the other group. They couldn't entirely do that. Obviously, there was, areas where there were a lot of Hindus in what would become Pakistan, like deep within Pakistan, and you can't really just carve those out and have them be enclaves for India, and vice versa as well. So, mostly what they did is they just tried to find the borders on the demographic map of India, showing, well, maybe not demographic, but a religious map of India. They tried to find the borders between the groups and have that be the official border between the two countries. There were enclaves carved out, but only for enclaves that were relatively close to the border, as it was decided. Enclaves further inland were just made a part of whatever country they were located in. So it was not entirely a systematic, entirely rational process. It was very much an expedited process, done more to save time than anything. But ultimately, that's what they ended up with, and that's how the modern borders of Pakistan were determined. Literally just carved out of British India over the course of like a couple months, probably not even that. It was, the actual design of the border was done by a guy from Britain, a British dude who had never been in Britain before, who had never been in India before. He was dispatched by the British government to go and design the new borders. So he went there, again, never been there before, and just looking at maps, based off of data that the government had collected, he just drew this line that became the border. Indian nationalists were less than enthused about this process and remain so to this day. But there wasn't much they could do about it at the time, and obviously Pakistan isn't really interested in changing the border as it is now. So it's pretty much become the permanent border as a result. There's been some more changes with Bangladesh, but that's kind of its own story. For those of you who maybe don't know, Bangladesh was originally a part of Pakistan. It was originally called East Pakistan because it was obviously majority Muslim. So of course it became part of Pakistan according to the rule of thumb in which majority Muslim areas became part of Pakistan. But that only lasted for maybe like 20 years. What was it? 48, 58, 68. So maybe around 25 years before tensions between East Pakistan and West Pakistan devolved, deteriorated to the point where the East Pakistanis were willing to fight for independence. They had been pushing just for mutual recognition, right? They wanted to have as much power in Pakistan's government as the other peoples in West Pakistan, because as was the West Pakistanis dominated the government. It was disproportionately manned by Punjabis in particular. And the Bangladeshis were not, the Bengalis, I should say, in East Pakistan were not really happy with that. They wanted greater representation in in government offices, and they were also not entirely happy with their representation in the legislature. They thought they were kind of getting shortchanged a little bit because I think East Pakistan at that time comprised something like half of the population of Pakistan, and they were getting less than half of the seats, something like that. So at first they just pushed for more rights. But the West Pakistanis, and well, basically the Pakistani government, and in particular the Pakistani security apparatus, got super paranoid about that. They were afraid that if they granted more rights, then maybe the Bengalis would start making more demands, maybe even pushing for independence. So they actually ignored largely the Bengali demands, and the result is that the Bengalis became radicalized over time. They started demanding for autonomy. We don't just want more rights; we want outright autonomy, so we can govern more, so we can have more responsibility for governing our own affairs. And so that seemed to justify the paranoia of the Pakistani security services. So they started cracking down even more on the Bengalis. And so you can see how this became a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The Pakistani security apparatus was afraid the Bengalis would eventually demand independence, but just by trying to prevent that, they ended up making it happen. They ended up radicalizing the Bengalis, and they ended up creating demand for independence in Bangladesh. So the Bengalis eventually started protesting and started demanding that the government either give them autonomy or give them independence. And so that led in the early 1970s to the Pakistani government committing a series of atrocities. They basically banned the principal pro-independence party in Bengal. And then they started attacking civilians who had been protesting, as well as just even civilians that had not been protesting. There was a lot of violence targeting civilians in this period in Bengal by the Pakistani military and Pakistani intelligence. And they did so as well with the support of Islamists in Bengal. There were local Bengali Islamists who supported the Pakistani government and formed militias that assisted security operations, up to in targeting people who were dissidents or killing people who were rivals and whatnot, this kind of stuff. And that eventually led the Indian government to launching a quote unquote humanitarian intervention in which the Indian government literally invaded Bengal and kicked out the Pakistani military. And it was at that point that East Pakistan became what is now known as Bangladesh, an independent country. The Indian government said it was humanitarian. Really, it was just, dealing a blow to a rival power, pretty much. That was actually the Third Indo-Pak War, as it's sometimes called in India. Yeah, the first one was actually really early on after independence. That was like 48, and then second one was 65. And so then this third one would have been 71, 1971, that is to say. So a whole series of confrontations there in that period, in a couple decades after independence with Pakistan. And so all of the action going on in Bengal was an easy, ready-made excuse for India to intervene. It also saved Indira Gandhi's prime ministership. She had been kind of unpopular up till that point, but winning a war against the nation's main rival definitely significantly boosted her popularity in Indian politics for a while. There, without getting, I mean, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but there was an energy crisis in the 70s that affected India as well as the rest of the world, and that significantly dented her popularity very soon after that war ended, which is actually what led to the declaration of emergency and authoritarian rule in India, and then the whole drama with the forced sterilizations and the Janata Dal opposition, and yeah, that's a whole story unto itself. But yeah, that was definitely an important event in Indian history. But anyway, we're talking about Pakistan. So Pakistan, Bengal becomes independent, it becomes Bangladesh, and so Pakistan loses its eastern chunk of territory. So again, that was about half of the country's population. And Bengal had actually generated a disproportionate share of Pakistan's exports because at that time, Bengal was still a major exporter of jute, which is like a kind of thread basically used to make rope. So losing Bangladesh was an economic blow, a political blow, a demographic blow. It was pretty tough strategically for Pakistan. Although it did have the single benefit of significantly simplifying Pakistan's defenses, because before they had to worry about defending not only West Pakistan but also Bangladesh. Whenever there was an Indo-Pak war, they had to kind of worry about that. But I don't think there had been a lot of fighting in Bengal in any of the previous Indo-Pak wars. Most of the fighting was generally over Kashmir, so that was disproportionately the focus. So after 71, Pakistan kind of chilled out a little bit. They didn't have a lot of choice. After independent, well, I guess I would kind of have to explain more of the background there too. I mean, basically everything, excuse me, basically everything that the Indian government and their leaders worried might happen to India after independence actually did happen to Pakistan. Like the leadership of India worried after independence that centrifugal forces would pull the country apart, that provinces would want independence, that democratic institutions would fail, and that there would be just a slew of problems that they wouldn't be able to resolve. India successfully navigated those issues. Pakistan did not. So, that's Pakistan is basically like the alternate history India, what India could have looked like if they had less successful, effective leadership in terms of like, the country holding together and other aspects. So, for an example here, Pakistan after independence spent something like 10 years trying to draw up a constitution. India drew up theirs relatively quickly. They kind of had theirs ready to go. But in Pakistan's case, they tried to negotiate it and they kept trying, but it just didn't happen. Like they just couldn't agree on anything. Part of the problem is that Jinnah died pretty early on. So, Indian National Congress and Independent India had a whole cohort of major leaders that they could look to. I mean, Jawaharlal Nehru was the principal one for India. And not everybody liked him, but he was a strong leader and he was able to kind of hold the country together and lead the Indian National Congress through the first, decade and a half roughly, 2 decades more like, of independence. So the major equivalent figure in Pakistan's history would have been Jinnah, who had been the leader of the Muslim League and then became the leader of Pakistan. but he died like within the first, what, year or two of independence. And there was no other equivalent figure within the Muslim League that had the same stature and the same leadership ability. And the result is that Pakistan suffered in that first 10 years in particular. They just were kind of rudderless. They didn't have the ability to corral all the different factions within the party to coalesce around a single constitution. So, so what ended up happening is that the military launched a coup. There were other factors involved in that, but just general political dysfunction resulted in the military staging a coup, and then the military became the dominant power in Pakistani politics, and it has been ever since. There have been periods when the military stepped down and gave control of the country back to civilian institutions, elected governments and whatnot, but that's never really lasted. Invariably, the civilians would do something the military didn't like, or there would be a war or whatever, and then the military would come back and launch another coup and seize control again. And so Pakistan's history has basically been intermittent civilian control versus military junta control for the past half century plus. Now, that's not to say Pakistan is totally bereft of democratic institutions. They do have them. They do have relatively strong civil society. They do have a relatively robust media. Obviously they have problems with censorship and military intimidation and whatnot. But relative to other authoritarian countries, Pakistan has a relatively robust civil society. So they still do have the kernel of democratic institutions there in Pakistan, but they have not proven as robust or uh, as effective in governing the country as equivalent institutions in India have been.
Getting institutions to work and be respected seems to be one of the most difficult things in civilization.
Yeah, that's a cultural thing. Like, I mean, I've probably said it a million times on here, but I'll say it again. Uh, you can have the best designed institutions on the planet, and it will not matter if you do not have people in those institutions who want them to work and who do not practice forbearance in terms of not doing things to undermine the integrity of those institutions. You need to have people who want it to work and who refrain from trying to make them fail in order to have effective institutions. So South Asia actually has relatively well-designed institutions in general, but sometimes some of the people who have been responsible for governing have not been like the most honest or the most effective or the most well-meaning. There's been issues there, and the result has been mixed out. The result has been a mixed record of healthy institutions in the region. In the United States, we've been much more fortunate. We have some of the best institutions in terms of design, although they are getting a little rickety. They could probably do with updating, but in general, pretty well designed institutions. But our problem is that successive generations of politicians have increasingly started undermining those institutions for their own personal benefit, basically. Some of that has to do with the rise of, modern ideology and ideological inflexibility amongst voters and the population. But politicians always have a choice. They can operationalize their constituents' anger in different ways. It doesn't have to be sabotaging the government in one way or another, or abusing the government's power. There are different ways that you can bring government, that you can bring your constituents' concerns to the table in ways that are much less destructive than the ways that they have been brought to the table more recently, over the past 10, 20 years or so in the United States. So people are important, culture is important, political culture is important, that's all part of the same bag there. But yeah, that's all part of maintaining effective institutions, just trying to get them to work. That is indeed very difficult, as you say. Yeah, Pakistan after the war over Bangladesh was kind of adrift for a while. One of the things that distinguished Pakistan from India after independence is that India embraced a neutralist approach to foreign policy. They didn't want to align with anybody in the Cold War. They just wanted to stay out of the way and do their own thing. Pakistan, by contrast, embraced the West and was very much an American ally during the Cold War, although the health of the relationship kind of waxed and waned with time. But in the 70s, in particular, the relationship with the United States was not very good. And that was because the Pakistani government was very upset with the United States government because the United States had not intervened in the war. Because from the Pakistani perspective, they were invaded by India, because again, Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan at the time, and the Indian army invaded Bangladesh. So, from the perspective of the Pakistani government, their ally, the United States, should have intervened in the conflict and helped protect them and their territory. The United States, which was technically obligated to do that by treaty, we actually did have a mutual defense treaty with them, did not want to do that. We did not want to fight a war with India, not least because that's just difficult because of India's sheer size, but also because we really did not want to push a country as large and important as India into the Soviet camp in the Cold War, because they were already becoming more friendly with the Soviets at that time. And so the US government was very aware of that and predicated their response to the war in 1971 around that fact. So we did send a carrier battle group to the region just to kind of show support basically for Pakistan, but they never actually did anything. We were just kind of there sharing our thoughts and prayers with the Pakistanis. So relations were not great after that. And they actually dropped the alliance after that. There was no treaty obligation, there was no mutual defense treaty after that war because the Pakistanis said that the treaty was worthless. Obviously, you're not going to protect us if we come under attack because that's exactly what you didn't do. So screw it. We're just going to scrap the treaty and we're going to do our own thing. And so for, roughly 10 years, that's how it was. And then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, things changed. Obviously, if you're Pakistan, the Soviet Union, the big communist superpower, invading a neighboring state is a serious national security issue. And from the perspective of the United States, that was a big strategic concern for us because we didn't want the Soviets expanding strategically. And it was also an opportunity to try to bleed them over time. So there was a confluence of interests there between the United States and Pakistan. And so we rekindled the relationship, so to speak, in the 1980s as we worked together to try to eject the Soviets and the Red Army from Afghanistan. So that worked out pretty well for about 10 years or so. But then eventually the war in Afghanistan ended, and then things got a little more dicey because in the 1990s, the Pakistani government started testing nuclear weapons. And understand this was not just testing nuclear weapons, it was a part of their nuclear development program. They had been working on a nuclear weapon and then they actually tested one. And this, of course, is a breach of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And the United States government was put in a somewhat awkward position. Because, on the one hand, Pakistan and actually also India, which was doing the same thing at the time, were countries that the United States wanted good relations with. But on the other hand, the Cold War was over, and we didn't really have to care as much about the region at that point. And so ultimately, a desire to not care won out, rather than maintaining the relationship or building one, as was the case with India. We ended up distancing ourselves from Pakistan and to a lesser degree India as a result of this period of nuclear weapons development. And so the relationship between Pakistan and the United States became worse again in the 1990s as a result. So we ended up being sort of on neutral terms, basically, in the 1990s. And it wasn't until the aughts that the relationship picked up again. And you can probably guess why. That was 9/11. And so, of course, Al Qaeda was famously mostly geographically located in Afghanistan. And so that gave the United States government a new impetus to get involved with Afghanistan. And so that gave us a new reason to improve relations with Pakistan. And the Pakistani government was, of course, happy to receive lots of new military aid and loans and other little benefits here and there that the United States gave them as a quid pro quo in exchange for their cooperation in Afghanistan.
What would their
So that
cooperation
worked.
entail?
Intelligence sharing, maybe some special forces activity, although I don't think the Pakistanis were that involved in that regard. Mostly it would have been intelligence sharing and also allowing the United States and US agencies of one sort or another access to Pakistani territory. A lot of the Taliban ended up crossing the border, into Pakistan and using Pakistan as a base of operations for their activities in Afghanistan. So that, of course, gave the United States good reason to try to cooperate with the Pakistanis. Now, the trouble with that is that over time, it became apparent that the Pakistanis were not entirely cooperating in good faith with the United States, especially during the Obama administration. The Obama administration became more and more upset with the Pakistanis at the fact that they were secretly supporting and maintaining contact with this, that, or the other resistance group in Afghanistan. Specifically the Haqqani network, the what were they called? The Quetta Taliban, and then I think also Hekmatyar is sort of one of the smaller factions in the Taliban coalition. So the Pakistani ISI, specifically the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency in Pakistan, which is like their big spy ops group, that was their big foreign intelligence agency, and they were secretly helping these groups, with funding and giving them access to uh, safe havens in Pakistan, and this kind of stuff. And it's debatable how much the Pakistani military knew about this. It's kind of hard to judge, but regardless, the Obama administration was upset about it, and we kept pressuring them to stop it. But there was only so much we could do because the Pakistanis had a lot of leverage. We needed access to Pakistan to get supplies and troops into Afghanistan, because obviously Iran was not going to do that. And also, we kind of depended on them to a degree for logistical support. And we also were still receiving some intelligence cooperation anyway. For example, the Pakistani government was secretly allowing the United States to conduct drone attacks in their territory. The famous drone assassination campaign by the Obama administration, which shifted focus. The Obama administration was the administration that really shifted the military's focus away from counterinsurgency towards counterterrorism. That was one of the big contributions that the Obama administration did. If they'd had their way, they probably would have just pulled out. But that was seen as unviable. So the compromise is that there would be less conventional warfare in terms of counterinsurgency, and a less that resulted in a smaller footprint for the U.S. military. If you're going to conduct counterinsurgency, you need lots of troops. And so, because the Obama administration wanted to pull out but could not, their compromise was to shrink the U.S. military's footprint in the region by shifting focus towards counterterrorism, which was much less reliant on large deployments of troops and more reliant on special forces, air support, and intelligence. So that was a big shift that they made. And but to do that, they needed to hit targets in the northwestern part of Pakistan, where the Taliban and a lot of their personal networks were located. And so the result was the famous drone assassination campaign, in which the Obama administration greenlighted a whole slew of drone strikes in the region there. Two mixed results. It had some effect, but it's debatable how much. But eventually, it kind of came out publicly within Pakistani politics that the Pakistani government was actually secretly condoning those strikes. There was kind of an implicit agreement that it was okay. But eventually that changed. There was a big backlash within Pakistan's politics. And there was also some other politics between the Pakistani government and the US government. The US did, I don't remember what it was exactly, but the US did something that they didn't like. And so they kind of retaliated by withdrawing their permission for the United States to conduct a lot of these drone strikes in their territory. So it may be that the Pakistani military was itself the one that leaked that information to the press in Pakistan, leading to the whole kerfuffle. But I don't remember enough details to judge that. But regardless, the relationship between the United States and Pakistan soured at this point. In like sort of around 2010, that's when it kind of started going downhill again, and it continued to kind of go downhill through the rest of the Obama administration, and then certainly through the Trump administration, which in particular wanted to kind of pressure Pakistan into doing more to help them fight the Taliban, which of course they did not do. And again, they were able to kind of use their leverage that they had over the United States to kind of prevent the Trump administration from doing anything too dramatic. And so the final result, of course, of the war in Afghanistan was the withdrawal in 2021. And at that point, that was sort of the nadir, for relations. At that point, we didn't have to care anymore about the region, at least not beyond, counterterrorism and chasing Al Qaeda and that kind of thing. And so that removed, uh, you know, a lot of tragic things happened because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I don't want to downplay that, but one of the upsides is that Pakistan lost most, if not all, of their leverage over the United States. So we no longer really have to care what they think too much. And that's put the United States in a position not only where we don't have to cater to the Pakistani government's needs and demands, but also where we don't really have to care at all. We're not really engaged with South Asia that much at this point. Like, I'm not really aware right now of any broader South Asian policy of either the Biden administration or even the late Trump administration. It kind of seems like they just wanted to leave and leave the region to its own devices. In so much as there's a foreign policy at all relevant to the region, it's the Quad, right? That's the famous group of four countries in the region that kind of work together to try to contain Chinese influence. So India is a part of the Quad. So that's about as much of a policy as the United States has at this point in South Asia. But that's not saying much because the Quad is a sort of famously weak institution. It's not like a treaty organization. It's not a formal institution with any kind of architecture to it. There's not like a standing committee of the Quad that kind of organizes standing affairs between them. It's really much more of an informal designation that recognizes cooperation between the countries on this, that, or the other issue. But beyond that, it's nothing like formal or anything. So it's not much. And it doesn't involve Pakistan at all. At this point, Pakistan is just kind of in the doghouse. And the United States government, I suspect, is taking some pleasure in the fact that they can kind of ignore them and let them sort of stew in their own problems.
What are their main problems right now?
Big one right now is economic. I mean, obviously, the flooding and whatnot is causing economic problems for them. But beyond that, Pakistan has not really been successful in developing its economy and trying to modernize it. And there's a lot of factors that kind of go into that. A big one is the Pakistani military itself, which is the dominant political force in Pakistani politics. The Pakistani military has expanded its presence throughout Pakistan. So it's not just a political force, it's also an economic force. Because what they did is they expanded military control, either direct or indirect, over a whole slew of industries in Pakistan. Some of those industries have military strategic significance, and so the military kind of controls those directly as state-owned enterprises. But then there is also indirect control, because what will happen is that the institution responsible for managing pensions for military personnel will actually invest in, this, that, or the other company. And because that pension fund is directly tied to the military, if it isn't directly controlled by it, that implicitly grants the military control over those industries that fund invests in. And there's a number of industries that receive that money. Now, the reason that's significant is because if you're that industry, if you are a firm controlled by that pension fund, and therefore the Pakistani military, you can actually use your political connections with those people to get special protections, as well as special favors that effectively act as a kind of economic rent that gives you a disproportionate advantage in the economy that your competitors don't have. So, on the one hand, that's great for your profits, but it's not great for the competitiveness of the economy as a whole. Because over time, basically, the less competitor, basically, it means that you don't have to invest as much in becoming and staying competitive. You can just use that rent you get from the favors and special privileges you get as part of being owned by the military. And so long as there weren't very many firms that were getting those privileges, that didn't have too much of an effect on the broader economy. But over time, the number of businesses owned by the military has grown to a greater and greater share of the economy. And the result has been the overall competitiveness of the economy has taken a hit. And so that's part of the reason that Pakistan's economy has not become as competitive or efficient as it would have been. It has this sort of bureaucratic inhibitor that is sort of blocking its development. There has been some progress made. They have made some strides in terms of investing in better infrastructure, and they actually used to have a lot of problems with electricity shortages. They've invested a lot in that, so that's not as much of a problem anymore either. But that said, because the overall economy is not very competitive, they've struggled with exports. And that's particularly a problem because Pakistan's economy is very, very import dependent. They import a lot of intermediate goods and final goods that they need to produce stuff for themselves, stuff like, fertilizers or intermediate goods for manufacturing, stuff like that. So because they're not exporting enough stuff to build up the currency reserves necessary to import stuff that they need, the discrepancy there has resulted in downward pressure on Pakistan's currency, and it's also made imports increasingly expensive. Now, they were able to kind of delay the impact of that by way of loans. They got a lot of loans from China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think they were able to get a loan at one point, like some years ago, from the IMF or maybe the World Bank. I don't remember which. And they also got a lot of private sector loans and stuff. And the government also tried to direct what little foreign reserve currency they had, tried to kind of ration it, so to speak. But all of that stuff just buys time. Like eventually, in order to become self-sustaining, they need to become more competitive. That's the only way to really resolve that underlying issue. But they haven't been really doing that, from what I can tell, from what I've read. And so that's a big problem just right there. And it's in particular become a problem recently because of all the global inflation. Energy has become much more expensive. And because, again, it's an import dependent economy, they've been disproportionately affected by that. So that's really put into focus negotiations over a loan from the IMF. One of the big major goals of the Pakistani government for the past few years actually has been negotiating a new loan with the IMF in order to try to stave off some kind of economic disaster. And that has had mixed results. Recent political drama in Pakistan has probably delayed the finalization of that negotiation for another year or two. It doesn't seem like anything is going to come soon, but the clock is ticking. Like sooner or later, foreign reserves are going to get to a critical level, and the overall economy is going to start suffering for it. It's just not entirely clear like when that point is going to come. There's lots of things you can do to stave off that point, but eventually it's going to have to come. Like equilibrium will assert itself eventually. So the IMF loan seems to be the preferred approach right now. Um, the IMF loan won't just be a loan, it's going to come with terms and conditions that require them to liberalize their economy to some degree. And the Pakistani government is probably going to be in a position where they wanted already to do that stuff, but can't for political reasons. And so the IMF is going to fill the same role that it actually normally fills, which is as a scapegoat. It's going to be the excuse that governments need to implement liberalizing reforms that they already wanted to implement and are needed, but that they couldn't implement for political reasons. But with the country on the edge of economic crisis, it's much easier to get away with that. They could just say, "Hey, we need money, and the IMF won't lend it to us unless we do all this terrible stuff that we totally don't want to do. So we have no choice, and you can't blame us for when we do it." And then, of course, they go on, they do it. Ideally, they're effective reforms, and the economy gets on a self-sustaining footing. Sometimes they're not, in which case you get a blowout, but that just depends on the leadership in question. But yeah, that's the main issue, economic. They're trying to negotiate an IMF loan to try to get their economy stabilized, on a more sustainable footing.
Mm.
They've also got separatist issues, in terms of national security. There's a province. I think there's only like really 4 or 5 provinces in Pakistan. One of the biggest by geographic size is a province in the southwest called Baluchistan. And the ethnic Baluchis have been fighting for an independent country for a couple decades now. But in particular, over the past 10, 15 years or so, violence has increased. And so the Pakistani government, Baluchistan does not have like a big population, so it's not like there's a lot of people to work with. So it's been relatively simple for the Pakistani military to sit on them and maintain control of the province. But that hasn't stopped terrorist attacks, hit and run attacks, and other forms of disruptive activity in the province. So part of what the Pakistani government is dealing with right now is also suppressing, revolutionary sentiment in that southwestern province.
So I have the map here. Southwest, you said?
Yeah. Yeah, if you zoom in, you could probably see some of the provincial borders. Yeah, the most important province is Punjab. I think that's the largest by population, and it's the most economically developed, and is basically just the beating heart of Pakistani politics and the economy.
And that's Punjab, which
That's
would be on the other side of the border of India's Punjab.
Yeah, yeah, that had all been one Punjab, but it was split in half basically.
Hmm.
So India's Punjab was basically Eastern Punjab, and then Pakistan's Punjab was Western Punjab. So that roughly would have been Eastern. That's roughly south northeastern Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
I think the city of Lahore is the largest city, the most important one in Pakistani Punjab. And then the southernmost province, sort of in the southeast, is Sindhi, and that's much more poor. And I think that's heavily agricultural even today. Although they do have, I think, maybe the largest city, or at least one of the largest cities in Pakistan, which is the port city of Karachi.
Hmm.
Karachi actually had not been a major city when Pakistan became an independent country back in 48, whenever it was. But it quickly became a large city because that became Pakistan's main port city.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all of the stuff that Pakistan imports comes through there. So at this point, it's a very large city. Maybe it's not quite a mega city. Let me see. I want to say like 10 million, 15 million. There we go. That's a lot of people, right? So that's a major city.
Yeah, because what Texas is like ballpark 30 million, and that's half the state right there.
Yeah, exactly. So Karachi became a very large city. So it's a little unusual for Sindhi in that regard. You know, most of the state is relatively undeveloped and rural. And then you have this big giant city here, this big urban conglomeration.
I just double check the population of Texas to make sure I didn't misspeak. It's about 28 to 29 million. So it was
There you
close.
go.
Hyderabad looks pretty big.
I don't think it's that big.
Just put the name as pretty big on the map. Yeah, you can see this green section has a pretty heavy concentration of streets and cities. But a lot of it looks really arid and not super populated.
Yeah, that's where Baluchistan is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't have nearly the population of the other regions of Pakistan.
So would you say like the overall population of Pakistan is pretty heavily concentrated on the side toward India, the east side?
Uh, yes, but more specifically along the river, the Indus River. You can kind of see it there.
Yeah, going all the way up here.
Yeah, I'll send you a density map of Pakistan, and that'll make it very clear. Let's see, let me do this. Yeah, that'll work. Send you that. You can see how it's very, very dark along the southern part of the river. And then in the northern part of the river, it basically adheres to the major tributary rivers in the northern Indus,
Ah, yeah, yeah.
or the northern Indus River, rather.
Yeah, so the Punjab region looks really concentrated with people. And then the northern part up there, I think that's where the capital is Islamabad.
Yeah, yeah, they put it up north, relatively close to Kashmir.
Hmm.
Yeah, Kashmir has kind of a weird relationship with Pakistan, because of course the Pakistanis thought that it should become part of Pakistan because it was Muslim majority. But the Hindu prince of Kashmir at that time wanted to become part of, well, he wanted to become independent, but then the Pakistanis tried to force the issue by sending a bunch of Pashtun militia into Kashmir to try to conquer it. So then the prince said that he wanted to be part of India. So then India moved in, and so that was the first Indo-Pak War, the war over Kashmir. So about a good chunk of Kashmir was controlled by Pakistan at the end of the war. So that part of Kashmir I think became known as Gilgit Baltistan, something weird like that. And it was recognized as a de facto independent country by the Pakistani government, technically. But in practice, the Pakistani government actually controlled Kashmir. You know, the people in charge of it were basically connected to the Pakistani military, intelligence, etc. So it was effectively an extension of Pakistan itself, but de jure, it was independent. I think recently they made some administrative changes to actually allow people in Pakistani Kashmir to have representatives in the legislature in Pakistan. So it's become more formally a part of Pakistan than it used to be. But historically, the line was much more blurry, much more ambiguous.
They've got some dotted lines up here in the north. Is that based on the contested territory that India and Pakistan tend to fight over?
Yeah, that's the line of control.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the one that moves sort of through the middle of the territory, that's where the fighting stopped in 1965.
Mm-hmm.
So Jammu and Kashmir there is the territory of Kashmir held by India,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can see the rest of it there that's held by Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the dotted line up in the north between Pakistan and China is also technically disputed, but they don't really fight over it because they're pretty close, diplomatically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that you can forget about China is it does dip into this area that's largely Muslim, religiously, culturally, etc.
Yeah, that's more where the famous Uyghurs live.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody is pretty familiar with them at this point.
Where are they actually? It's because Xinjiang is massive. It's like a huge
Yeah.
province area, but the population
Yeah.
density looks pretty low.
Oh yeah, very low. I think there's only like 10 million, maybe 20 million people in Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not much. Population density. Yeah. Images. Yeah, if you look at a population density map of China, like it barely registers.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this would be the one to use. So that map I sent you just now should gives you an idea of where the population is in Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they tend to cluster kind of more around the what would you call them? The mountains, basically. Sort of where the mountains meet the plains.
It's these big, huge areas uninhabited. Uninhabited. There's the India
Yeah.
claim line there. See if I can zoom this a little bit. Yeah, there we go. And then Pakistan touches China right there. There's the Chinese line of control. So China controls up to this point, but India says that, hey, that's our stuff. And they are willing to sword fight them in the valleys, which we saw a couple of years ago on Agent Smith.
Oh yeah, yeah. Up in what was it Doklai Plateau? I think that was.
Yeah, so the people up here are going to look more similar to Kazakhs and people from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Pakistan than they would look like Han Chinese.
Interesting you mentioned that. They actually don't.
Oh,
Yeah, that's people in Xinjiang and people in Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. They tend to be pretty Asiatic in appearance. You know, they sort of look like East Asians.
mm-hmm.
But people in Pakistan and in Kashmir tend to look much more South Asian. You know, they tend to have more Indo-European physical features.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because people from Pakistan, they look more Arabic. It's like a mixture between Arabic and Indian.
Uh, North Indian, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
It's all pretty similar.
Then there's another Chinese claim line down here in India, in the northeastern part of it.
Oh, Arunachal Pradesh.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that in our big India episode of how that's they make that claim, but there's not really much there to fight for, and that's where there are a bunch of Christians in the area.
Well, yeah, that's northeastern India is where the Christians are. I don't know how much penetration they've made into Arunachal Pradesh though.
Hmm.
But yeah, that northern border there is definitely disputed. I think the Chinese technically claim the entire province,
Hmm.
which is a lot. Yeah, that would definitely put them on the other side of the Himalayas.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was there was some fighting there during the border war in the early 1960s between India and China. They fought over Arunachal Pradesh in the northeast, and then there was fighting in the northwest. The Indians did not do very well. They kind of they kind of got obliterated. China probably could have made more progress, but I think they were a little concerned about the potential for Western intervention. The United States actually gave India a lot of cargo planes so that they could rush troops and supplies to the fighting
Hmm.
because there wasn't a lot of infrastructure, or even not on even today there's not very much. So it was pretty hard to actually get military supplies and troops up to the area where the fighting was. So the United States helped them out during the war in that regard.
Hmm.
And we were also giving them weapons and intelligence sharing, spy planes and whatnot. And we were starting to move aircraft in, and we were kind of dropping little hints that we might actually provide air support. So I think that's kind of what caused China to sort of back off there. Also, I think they just didn't really want the territory that much. It's probably just easier. They kind of made their point. It wasn't actually the Chinese that started that war either. It was actually India. They, they sent some Indian troops up to a disputed area and they tried to kind of force the issue. They wanted to kind of settle it by just occupying it. And they assumed that the Chinese government would not really react very strongly to that, but obviously they were quite wrong.
Mm.
And the response was sufficiently strong to overwhelm the Indian Army's defenses in the border regions. Yeah, that was pretty embarrassing for the Nehru administration.
And these regions, part of the reason why there's not like major all-out conflict is because the terrain is ridiculous and difficult to navigate because you've got like the Himalayas all around this area.
Yeah, yeah, it's extremely rugged territory. So there's been relatively little cross-border traffic, so to speak, of either a commercial, military, or demographic nature.
Hmm. We touched on that a little bit, just the general concept of how difficult it is to move stuff during the tanks segment with
Hmm.
Taurus. He knows a lot about a bunch of the different types of tanks and how some of them. There was this one tank he pointed out that had a maximum speed of 8 miles per hour, and that was going downhill, and it couldn't even really go uphill if it was more than a 2% grade. So just imagining like you're in the mountains. Good luck with your tank. It's like not going to be maneuverable at all.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, that was a fun segment.
Yeah. I didn't know he had so much knowledge about tanks, but that's like his thing if he just like to learn about each one. A lot of the tanks in the game actually never saw battle much. Like maybe there were some prototypes and maybe a few went out there, but a lot of them were failed experiments just because it's so hard to get something that has the right balance of mass and armor and also mobility and also firepower and the ability to aim and shoot and penetrate targets. Pretty crazy. And then with the current conflict in Ukraine, we're kind of seeing the consequences of if you don't have a well-rounded army force and you just send any type of random unit in where it's not a cohesive unit with different supporting units, you can basically get them taken out for very cheap. You need dudes with guns next to the tank. As dangerous as that sounds to everyone involved.
Have you heard of what are they called? Assault guns.
Assault rifles, but what's an assault gun?
So, in the context of World War II, assault guns were roughly speaking a class, and Taurus would know more than me, but maybe you could ask him about this. But assault guns were basically anti-tank guns. Like you've seen those, right?
Yeah.
Just like the basic anti-tank gun, like in a fixed emplacement, almost like an artillery piece.
Mm-hmm.
So what they would do is they would take an artillery. What they would do is take an anti-tank gun and they would just put it on treads,
Mm-hmm.
and that was an assault gun. And generally, they kind of looked similar to tanks, but the big difference was that they were much more poorly armored.
Mm-hmm.
That they were not well protected. Basically, the idea was just to make the assault. Basically, the idea was just to make the anti-tank guns much more mobile.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led into another class of vehicles called tank destroyers, which were basically just upgraded assault guns.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much the same idea.
Yesterday, I did an hour of the World of Tanks, and he talked about some of the World War One tanks and how one of the common ways that the tank drivers would get hurt was shots that were fired at the tank would cause shrapnel from the inside of the tank to hit them. So they would wear what looked like medieval armor. Did you see the
Oh, wow.
images he sent me of that? I can pull them up real quick.
No, I hadn't seen
They
that.
look hilarious. It's like kind of a dystopian steampunk looking thing with a chainmail mouth covering. There's like a leather goggle, and then there's these tiny metal slits covering the eyes, and then you've got a metal hard hat on the top. And this is what you would wear inside the tank that's already really hot. So it certainly wouldn't be very comfortable, and from the looks of it, you can't really see shit. But if shrapnel is bouncing around on the inside of the tank, your face is fine. There's another example here with a person wearing one.
Oh, wow. That must have been very uncomfortable. I know it got really hot in those tanks.
Yeah. He was saying they didn't put air conditioning in tanks until very recently. It's just like you're not really trying to optimize for driver comfort as long as they can live and shoot.
Yeah, I remember the first tanks were also really, really loud because there basically just wasn't anything separating you from the engine.
Oh, Taurus is here. He said the second one is French. The first one was British. They look pretty similar. Chainmail mouth covering, metal slit goggles, leather mask, and a hard hat. Just put each person inside a tiny tank inside the larger tank. Yeah, and then some of the tanks in World of Tanks were like based on some idea of like, what if we made the biggest tank ever? And they're like, this is awesome. Let's do the blueprints. And they like get all the blueprints. They build a prototype, and they're like, shit, it can't move. We're gonna have to pitch this whole idea and make a more reasonable tank. There's one in the game that's a Japanese tank that was supposed to have a crew of 12, and it was this massive heckin' thing. And again, it can't do shit because it can't move, so anything can just move around and shoot it from the side, kind of a deal. There's someone whose dad was a tank pilot, and he said that even with the AC, it's not enjoyable after you shoot around. It's pretty hot.
Huh. Interesting. Wouldn't the driver be pretty separated from that? I thought they had their own compartment.
If the thing that's shooting the gun is connected to the tank, metal is a very good conductor of heat.
Fair
So
point.
it would make sense that it just transfers throughout the vehicle. Probably doesn't like overheat and damage the vehicle, but it can definitely heat up the air on the inside.
Gotcha, gotcha.
And another thing too would be ventilation. Like, how is the inside of the tank ventilated with outside air? Because if it's not ventilated well, you've got hot bodies inside and hot guns shooting, and then a hot engine running. And you don't really want big openings, because then you
Yeah.
can get shot.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's why they got all those periscopes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I had too much on Ukraine to update with. And some information, and I forgot to mention last week that Wagner Group's headquarters in Ukraine was hit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was artillery or HIMARS, but it did get blown up, and it actually got blown up not long after Prigozhin was visiting. Prigozhin is the guy that kind of leads the Wagner group.
And they set up a headquarters in Ukraine, you said?
Oh yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. There's a lot of Wagner troop mercenaries in Ukraine right now.
Hmm.
Yeah, he came for a visit and he almost got assassinated.
Hmm.
Yeah, they just missed him. Yeah, he's been quite the busy bee lately, Prigozhin. Do you remember the FSB letters guy?
Sounds familiar. Was this the
There was a guy.
the person who was leaking the communications and like the battle plans and stuff?
No, I don't think battle plans. It was a guy who said he says he's an FSB agent, and he's been basically just talking about the Russian government's internal politics, bureaucratic infighting, stuff like
That's the
that.
Twitter account.
Yeah, there is a Twitter account where that's being posted.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was saying that Prigozhin has been getting more aggressive within Russian politics. Like he was openly sparring, publicly with the mayor of St. Petersburg.
Hmm.
And apparently he's been kind of looking for opportunities to expand his influence in the government. And so this is the kind of, maybe not infighting per se, but maneuvering within the government that he had been expecting. And this could come to become a dominant phenomena. This could become a growing theme within Russian politics going forward,
Hmm.
depending on how the different coalitions within the government respond to the pressures of the war. Prigozhin, in particular, has an advantage because he has this military asset, Wagner Group, that he can use as leverage. So something to keep an eye on, in so much as you think the FSB letters guy is worth listening to.
Hmm.
It's not entirely clear just who he actually is or if he is who he says he is. He's been right about some stuff. He ended up calling that weird explosion in Moldova. He kind of predicted that, so that's kind of to his credit. But we'll see. Time will tell.
Hmm. There were a couple
Okay.
questions. I don't know if you saw them.
Oh, sure.
Does Agent Smith know anything about the potential for U.S. railroad worker strikes / effects if it happens?
I mean, the effects are obvious. That's just going to make the logistical problems worse. The supply chain will get more backed up, stuff will cost more, etc. But as far as how likely it is, I don't know. I don't think I've ever even heard of a rail strike in the United States. I think normally they pretty well stay on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes without saying if you're American, but if you're not American, and I think we've got more than a few listening by now, given the hour. Yeah, I think we've got a lot in the flag. Yeah, we got a whole bunch in the flag section. So in the United States, we don't have a lot of passenger rail traffic. That's you could probably guess, but very little of the rail traffic is passenger traffic. The vast majority of the rail traffic in the United States is freight rail. And freight rail in the United States is actually really efficient. It's pretty well done, pretty well managed from what I've read about it. So if there were a rail strike, it would definitely be freight that was disproportionately impacted, as opposed to, say, passenger traffic, which might be of more interest in, say, Europe or China or what have you.
Yeah, in the U.S., we disproportionately drive cars to get from place to place.
Yeah, for short trips, cars, longer trips, air travel,
Mm-hmm. I
easily.
actually got to know a little bit about rail from a train trip that I was taking from Oregon to Washington, and I had a 4-hour delay. And
Oh, wow.
the people working in the train station were like, "Oh yeah, it happens." And I was like, "That's a big delay. Like, why does it happen?" They're like, "Oh, freight." Oh, okay. So freight just gets priority. They can basically do whatever they want, and whenever there's an opening, the passenger trains can do stuff. But we
Yeah,
definitely prio the freight for that.
yeah, bingo. Perfect example.
Another question: has Agent Smith read the Rand research report titled "The Return of Great Power War Scenarios of Systemic Conflict Between the United States and China"?
Sounds familiar, but no, I have not read it.
I will copy the title of that to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I do remember some actually more like 10 years ago, there were some think tanks that had been predicting that there would be a potential return to great power conflict because of, technological changes, strategic rivalries, and whatnot.
And then Havoc asked, what is Agent Smith's thoughts on filial piety and Confucianism and its relationship with current Chinese political nepotism?
Hmm. An interesting topic. I don't think they're all that related. Certainly, nepotism has a role within Chinese politics. The princelings, again, are an example of that. So, in so much as nepotism is a factor, you can attribute that to filial piety and the importance of family within Chinese culture. But overall, corruption is really a lot more about opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your family can give you connections, but really, most of the connections that you're going to make are the ones that, well, the most of your important connections are probably going to be the ones you make yourself over the course of, say, your career. Friends you make in school, for example, business partners who you work with. These kinds of connections are just as important, if not more so, than family connections. So whoever can kind of do you favors and can earn your trust, basically, that guy is going to be in your network, and that's going to be an important factor there. So that's not really as relevant to filial piety. That's more just how networks work in general and definitely have worked in China since Chinese politics has been a thing, for thousands of years. Patronage networks have been forming in Chinese politics since the very beginning. So yeah, filial piety is a factor in so much as families are a part of patronage network formation, but overall, there's lots of other nodes and networks that are made beyond the family that are just as important, if not more so.
Yeah, as a random thought, I would guess that since they have the culture of filial piety, nepotism might not seem as negative connotation of a word as it does here, because just based on how norms and stuff change over time, like you can have cultural anchors to concepts that can be more or less palatable or tasteful. Like maybe for them it's not as big of a deal because yeah, you look after yourself and your family, and your guangxi matters, and you can count on your family more than you can count on a lot of random people. So you're trying to
Hmm.
build a broad network, and your family is a part of that network. In the US, it's like nepotism is a thing. We see a lot of that in government. Like we had multiple Bush presidents. We've had the Clintons in politics for a long time. The Trump family does and says a lot of stuff. There's like the Hunter Biden shit. Like your family relations matter, and they do have an impact on your power structure underneath you and around you, and your opportunities and that kind of stuff. Who is it? McCain's daughter is a senator in Wyoming or something now. So there are plenty of examples of nepotism, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if you have a parent or something who's in a certain sphere, it gives you a bunch of natural points of contact to also get into that, and they can teach you a bunch of stuff. So it's not necessarily inherently evil. The issue is whenever you're being corrupt about it and basically allowing them to skip certain lines and not really earn their place in a fair capacity. That's like the dark side of nepotism. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, family connections are, corruption, family connections are not just about, corrupt network formation. It can also just be about innate, so to speak. Like in business, for example, networking is like one of the most important things you do. Like you need to build trust with your customers, with your suppliers, with your financiers. Trust is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so your network of trusted contacts is basically the beating heart of whatever operation you have running.
Mm-hmm.
So to a degree, that's just a normal part of just human existence, like building networks of one kind or another to accomplish something. That's just normal human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of like Chinese politics in particular, that normal human behavior uh, unfortunately ends up being one of the leading drivers of political outcomes. Normally you would prefer to have political institutions that can generate outcomes that are representative of the desires of the population as a whole. rather than being more dependent on the desires and needs of individual networks and the maintenance thereof.
Hmm. Oh, nice. I had a
Well,
later start today than I normally do, so I'll probably end before we get you going for the full 3 hours, if that's cool with you.
oh yeah, I know you're up late. Thank you for indulging me.
Yeah, I always have a good time. I was on the phone quite a bit to report a very happy visit I had last week, so catching up with my parents and stuff was very good, but that does mean that my stream started like 4 hours later than it normally does. But that's all good. Mr. Agent Smith was still keen even in the later hours of the night. Oh, forgot to ask you. Taurus was wondering how your Stellaris, or what is it, RimWorld campaign is going. You still doing that? Your alcoholic cat. Is it okay?
Yeah, the cat is fine.
Hmm.
Actually, I did buy a replacement cat, and then they started breeding, and then I ended up with way too many cats. So I had to release some of them to the wild because I couldn't sell them. I kept trying to wait for like a merchant to come that I could sell them to, but nobody wanted to buy. It's like an exotic type of good. So I ended up just releasing some to the wild. I ended up keeping, I think, like one that was much younger than my original cat,
Mm-hmm.
and he was supposed to be the replacement for when the other one died.
Mm.
But then the replacement ended up getting blown up by a mortar during a battle, so tough
Why
luck.
was it in the battle?
It wasn't in the battle. I mean, I just ended up getting raided.
Ah, I
It was
see.
it was a really big raid. It was like a big event, basically, where I had like two different groups of raiders form mortar teams. So I think I had like four mortars mortaring my base at one point. And yeah, I got torn up pretty good by that. I didn't have a good defense for that. I was caught unprepared. There's some reasons for that, but I won't bore you with the background. But yeah, the cat bought it as a result.
Hmm.
But the original cat is fine. He has recovered from his alcoholism and is doing nicely. But I haven't played RimWorld in a while now.
Have you been playing
Yeah,
something
I ended
else?
up. Yeah, I've been actually I upgraded my operating. Yeah, this is going to be stupid, but I operated my operating system finally from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Been
Welcome
putting that
to
off for
2020.
yeah, yeah, I've been putting that off for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I did that, besides the fact that I'd meant to do it, I also realized that I could no longer play Star Trek Online
Mm.
with Windows 7. They ended support a while ago. And I've been watching some Star Trek stuff on YouTube recently, and that kind of got me in the mood again. And so that was sufficient to finally get me off my ass and get me to upgrade the operating system. So that's more what I've been doing for the past week or two. I've been delving into Star Trek Online a little bit.
Do you have a smartphone yet?
I do
Ah.
because of the 4G upgrade.
Hmm.
AT&T basically ended support for their 3G phones because they were ending their 3G network and upgrading just to exclusively 4G. And so for all of the all of the poor losers such as myself that were hanging on to our old 3G flip phones, AT&T said, "Hey, you know, if you keep your business with us, we'll give you a free smartphone." To which I said, "No, I'd rather just keep my flip phone. Thank you." But and then they just basically said, "No, you have to. You just if you want to keep your account, you have to change phones." So I said, "Fine." You know, they actually did give me the option of doing like a 4G flip phone, but at that point I kind of figured, you know, smartphones are kind of expensive. They're going to give me one for free, and sooner or later I need to learn how to use one
Mm-hmm.
since they're kind of an important part of, you know, modern society. So I took the opportunity to get a free smartphone. So I have had one for a year plus now.
Agent Smith is
Actually, I
being
have,
forced into the modern world by 4G and Star Trek News at 11.
yeah, pretty much. I actually have two smartphones because AT&T sent me one.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, what was it? I remember kind of, oh, that's what it was. They gave you like a certain amount of time to activate it. And I was kind of putting that off too because I'm a terrible procrastinator, obviously. And eventually, AT&T apparently just decided to send me another one. I got it in the mail and I called them and I said, "Hey, you already sent me one." I just haven't activated it yet. And they said, yeah, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Just keep them both. And I was like, really? You're just gonna give me phones? So I said, all right. So I've got one smartphone that I've been using, but then I have another one that's actually still in its package that I'm still trying to figure out what to do with. I was thinking of installing WeChat on it and using it as my sort of go-to contact device for my Chinese friends. But that plan is still in the design phase. I'm procrastinating. I'm procrastinating on that too, unfortunately.
Yeah, procrastination is real. I've been still doing my burpees thing. One of the things that I'm trying to crank out here is getting some skits going. I want to
Oh yeah.
get a couple of characters. I want to make a new character that's kind of the opposite of my principles, like the gamer bro. And I got his name and I got his outfit yesterday. So he's going to basically be the representation of the BM gamers on Twitch and in Dota and StarCraft and stuff like that, and have a lot of that attitude. Because I
Oh,
don't do those things myself anymore. I used to back when I was a Han gamer, where I would call people trash can and all this kind of stuff. But nowadays, I teach people to be nice. But I wasn't always that way, and a lot of gamers are still the very much dude bro, gatekeeping. Everyone's like trying to talk shit to get people to quit and that kind of a thing.
sure.
Oh.
Well, I look forward to that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, we'll see. I want to keep it pretty short form and punchy, because one of the things with succeeding on YouTube is attention span. You've got some people, shout out to the lovely people in the chat and YouTube video watching Agent Smith. This is a very long form kind of content where we get to discuss a broad range of ideas and really get into the nitty gritty of some stuff. Whereas some people, they just get on YouTube because they want to like laugh for 2 minutes and then leave. So a 3-hour Agent Smith video is not going to be for that viewer. It's going to be for more of the thinking person who gets a glass of wine and they just listen and think about the world. Whereas a lot of the younger crowd, they're more used to the TikTok video, lower attention span, just get something fast and punchy and memorable so you can watch it and share it. So we'll try that.
Yeah, you've got business acumen. I respect that.
I'm trying. I'm definitely more of a fly by the seat of my pants kind of a guy than a heavy planner, but I've been keeping myself accountable with a notepad that I have for my burpees challenge, and I've been also writing in some just other life stuff that I want to knock out with that. So if you're feeling stuck, chat and Agent Smith, having a pencil and paper to-do list is actually pretty good. I know it sounds old school and hokey, but if there is that list on a table or something that you're always looking at, it kind of yells at you to get stuff done, which is nice.
Yeah. Good tips.
Yeah. Well, I think I will get some rest now. Thank you, Agent Smith, for your wisdom and discussion.
Thank you for having me. Always a privilege.
You got your 20-minute walk assignment. I've been playing Pokemon Go and getting outside doing that, so
There you go.
there's my laps there. But we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. See you next time.
GG.